Have you ever experienced that singular moment where everything changes in a single breath? That precise second where what you thought you knew about the world gets flipped upside down in the darkness, and you realize with sudden clarity that you're never going to look at an ordinary night the same way again? That is exactly what happened to a young army specialist named Marcus Chen during his deployment to a fire base in Kunar province, Afghanistan. And what he experienced out there on that freezing February night would end up haunting him far longer than his remaining tour ever could. Marcus was a good soldier. He wasn't the flashy hero type you see in war movies, but the steady kind. The guy who showed up to his shifts early, kept his eyes open, and did what needed doing without complaint. He'd been stationed at Firebase Outpost 12 for about 4 months when that night came around. The firebase was small, housing maybe 50 soldiers total, perched precariously on a ridge that overlooked 3 deep valleys. It was the kind of place that felt like the absolute edge of the world. Beyond the wire, there was nothing but jagged rocks, scrub brush, and a darkness that went on forever. February in that part of Afghanistan brings a specific, biting cold. It's the kind of cold that gets into your bones and settles there, making you move slower than you want to. The wind comes off the mountains with teeth in it. Some nights, the enlisted guys would rotate through watch on the perimeter, and most nights, absolutely nothing happened. But Marcus always felt something different about this particular mountain. It wasn't just nerves, it was something that seemed to pay attention. He'd mentioned it to his sergeant once, and the guy had just laughed it off, blaming it on mountain nerves that everybody got. But Marcus wasn't talking about fear exactly. He was talking about that heavy feeling you get when you know something unseen is looking back at you, like the air itself has weight. On February 19th, Marcus drew the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift on the eastern perimeter. Not the worst time, but certainly not the best. That window sits right in the deepest, quietest part of the night when your body wants to shut down and your eyes start playing tricks on you. The firebase had decent lighting, a few spotlights on the corners of the compound, but beyond the wire, the darkness was almost alive. Marcus did his walkthrough of the section he was responsible for. Everything looked normal. The fence was intact, no debris in the kill zone. The observation post he'd be using was set up correctly with good sight lines into the valleys. He took his position and waited for the previous guard to head back to the barracks. Cold filtered through his jacket, so he pulled his hood tighter and settled in. The first hour passed like they usually did. The wind moved through the rocks below. Somewhere off to the west, a dog was barking, just animal sounds, nothing that should have held his attention. But Marcus found himself listening harder than usual. He was alert in a way he didn't quite understand. Around 2:30, something changed. It started with the wind stopping, not gradually, just stopping. Marcus noticed because the constant pressure against his face and body vanished all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The night went from windy to completely, utterly still. It was the kind of silence that's almost loud in itself. He turned slowly, scanning his sector with night vision goggles. Everything looked clear. The ridgeline was empty. The rocks were just rocks. But something in his chest was beating a strange rhythm now, faster than before. His hand moved to the safety on his rifle, a motion that happened without conscious thought. Then he heard it. A footstep. Not from the valleys, not from the direction you'd expect an actual threat to come from. This was closer. Much closer. It was coming from inside the wire, from the area between the barracks and his position. Marcus turned sharply, raising his weapon. The NVGs painted everything in shades of green. He could see clearly enough, and there was nothing there. He lowered his weapon but kept the muzzle pointed in that direction. Maybe it had been something he'd heard wrong. An echo off the compound walls. Afghanistan was full of sound tricks, and the mountains made noises do strange things. Marcus waited. Nothing moved. 20 minutes passed. Marcus had started to convince himself he'd been paranoid when he heard it again. This time, there were multiple footsteps. More than one person moving in what sounded like a patrol pattern along the perimeter road. The same road he'd walked just 90 minutes before. He called it in to the command post. "This is Echo 2-7. I'm hearing movement inside the wire, section east. Possible personnel moving on the perimeter road. Can you check if anyone else is conducting operations out here?" The response came back after a few seconds. "Echo 2-7, this is CP. Negative. All personnel are accounted for in barracks. Only you operating in your sector. Investigate and report." Marcus's stomach tightened. He was trained for this. You hear unauthorized movement, you investigate. You find out what's going on. It's basic security. He climbed down from the observation post and moved toward where he'd heard the sounds, keeping his rifle ready, moving quietly. The footsteps stopped the moment he started moving. That was the first real moment of fear. Actual, genuine fear that made his breathing shallow. Because combat sounds were one thing. You expected those. But something that heard you moving and went still in response, that was something else entirely. Marcus pressed himself against the side of a storage container and waited. His eyes scanned the darkness, glasses off now because the darkness was so complete he figured his naked eyes might work better. They didn't. It made him feel more blind. He was about to call it in again and request backup when he saw the shape. It was standing in the middle of the perimeter road, maybe 30 yards from his position. Humanoid. That was the only word for it. It had the general outline of a person, 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. But something about its proportions was wrong. The shoulders were too broad. The way it stood was too still, too deliberate. For maybe 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Marcus had his rifle up, the weapon pointed directly at the thing, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard. Every piece of his training was screaming at him to challenge it, to demand identification, but he couldn't get the words out. The thing shifted, not walked, shifted, like something in those old horror movies, teleporting from one spot to another without moving through the space between. 1 second it was on the perimeter road, the next second it was closer, maybe 15 yards away. Marcus fired. The sound of his rifle crack through the night seemed to break something. Alarms started blaring immediately from the command post. Lights came on across the firebase. But what mattered to Marcus was that the shape was gone. Just gone. No body on the ground, no sound of something running. It had simply ceased to be in that space. Personnel came pouring out of the barracks. His sergeant hit the perimeter with half the squad, weapons drawn, lights sweeping the darkness. Marcus stood there, still pointing his rifle at empty air, trying to remember how to breathe. What happened next was a mixture of military procedure and confusion. A sweep of his sector found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of life. No evidence that anything had been standing where Marcus swore it had been standing just minutes before. His sergeant took his statement. Then the first sergeant took his statement. Then the captain wanted to hear what he'd seen. By the time the questions finished, it was nearly 4 a.m., and Marcus was running on pure adrenaline and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fear. "You sure it wasn't a shadow?" One of the junior enlisted guys asked. "Say, shadows can look like things out here. The light plays tricks." Marcus said nothing. He knew what he'd seen. The captain decided that they'd do a full sweep at first light, that maybe some insurgent had gotten through in the dark and triggered Marcus's awareness. A loose perimeter somewhere. They'd find where he got in. Standard procedures. Nothing unusual about that. But Marcus knew different. Over the next 2 days, he couldn't stop thinking about the thing's movement. The way it had shifted position without traversing the space between points. The way it had heard him moving from inside the wire and gone still in response. The way it had simply vanished when he fired. He tried talking to a couple of the other guys about it, just casually, to see if anyone else had ever experienced anything weird on the mountain. Most people shut down that conversation fast. One guy, a mechanic named Devereaux, pulled him aside and said, "Don't talk about that out loud, not here." When Marcus asked why, Devereaux just shook his head. Because once you start noticing things like that, they start noticing you back. Marcus's next shift on the perimeter wasn't until 4 days later. He spent those days jumping at shadows, sleeping poorly, running the encounter through his mind over and over. What had it been? Had it been human? The proportions had been wrong. Even given how darkness and distance could distort things, the proportions had been wrong. When his shift came around again, it was a different section of the perimeter, the northern side this time. Marcus was almost relieved to be in a different spot, which was silly because he didn't really believe the thing was localized to one area. But you tell yourself things in the military, you rationalize, you convince yourself that your previous experience was an anomaly, that things will be normal this time. That night was crystal clear, no clouds at all. The stars were so bright they cast actual shadows on the ground. The temperature had dropped to maybe 15 degrees. Good visibility. Excellent visibility, really. Marcus thought that would help. It didn't. Around the same time as before, 2:30, the wind stopped. And this time Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed. The observation post 2 sections over, manned by a private named Riley, called into the command post. Something weird is happening with the wind. Anyone else? It's like someone switched it off. The command post confirmed they were reading no wind changes on the weather station, but acknowledged the report. Everything seemed normal from their perspective. Except it wasn't. Marcus heard footsteps again, but this time there were more of them. And this time, they didn't stop when he moved. They mirrored his movements. When he went left, they went left. When he stopped, they stopped. When he moved right, they moved right, staying approximately 30 yards away from him, in the darkness just beyond where his position could clearly see. He called it in. Perimeter north. I've got movement tracking my position, multiple contacts. Approximately 30 yards distance, maintaining pace with my movement. This time, the captain was listening to the radio. Say again, perimeter north. Movement tracking your position, affirmative, sir, Marcus replied, his voice tight but steady. Whatever it is, it's matching my movement. I stop, it stops, I move, it moves, keeping consistent distance. The captain paused. Could be an animal. Curious, maybe. Marcus shook his head, even though no one could see him. Negative, sir, this is something else. Silence on the radio for a few seconds. Then, maintain position. Remain alert. We're dispatching a squad to your location. Marcus kept his eyes on the darkness where the movement was. He could see shapes, but they weren't clear enough to get a good read on them. Multiple entities, though. He was sure of that. At least 3, maybe more. The things didn't make aggressive movements. They didn't charge, but they didn't leave either. They simply maintained their distance, keeping pace, like they were studying him, like they were curious. A squad showed up about 8 minutes later. The moment the soldiers appeared, the shapes in the darkness began to withdraw. Not run, not flee, just slowly, deliberately back away. The soldiers started to pursue them into the darkness beyond the perimeter, but the captain called them back. Leave them. Get perimeter security tightened. Double watch points for the rest of the night. Whatever this is, we're establishing rules of engagement right now. Anything that crosses the wire gets engaged. Am I clear? Yes, sir, the soldiers called back. But things didn't cross the wire that night. They just kept their distance, kept watching, and vanished somewhere into the darkness before dawn. After that second encounter, Marcus started researching. He had access to the firebase's limited internet through a shared terminal where guys checked email once a week, if they were lucky. He didn't search for ghosts or supernatural because that seemed insane. But he did search for military phenomena, for strange events reported at bases, for accounts from soldiers who'd seen things they couldn't explain. He found more than he expected. There were stories from Fort Hood about soldiers seeing shapes that would vanish when challenged. Reports from Bagram Airfield of figures that would move between positions impossibly fast. Accounts from soldiers in Iraq describing humanoid figures that seemed to mirror their movements. Nothing official, nothing confirmed. Just stories passed between guys mentioned in forums and chat rooms. The strangest one was from a Vietnam vet named Harold Sinclair. Harold had been doing a night watch somewhere in the jungle in 1968 when he'd seen something similar. He'd gone to investigate, and when he was only about 10 yards away from the shape, it had opened its eyes. Harold's account was brief, written when he was already in his 70s, but the fear in those words was still palpable. He'd said the eyes were wrong. Not human, not any kind of animal, just wrong. The thing had looked at him for maybe 2 seconds and then it had been gone. Harold didn't know where it went, just that it wasn't there anymore. He'd spent the rest of the war doing combat operations, and he'd never seen anything like it again. But the memory had never left him. Marcus printed out the account. He kept it in his pocket for almost a week before burning it in a small fire behind the barracks. His next shift came 8 days later. This time it was the western perimeter, a section that had a better view of the valleys below. Marcus had talked to some of the more experienced soldiers about procedures for encountering unknown entities inside the wire. Most of them just made jokes or changed the subject. But one older staff sergeant, a guy named Kowalski who'd been around the world more than once, had pulled him aside and said something that stuck with him. If you see it again, Kowalski had said, don't try to engage it like it's human. Don't try to talk to it. Don't fire at it unless it directly threatens you. Just observe it. Let it know you see it, but don't escalate. When Marcus had asked why, Kowalski had said, "Because it's testing you, seeing how you'll react. And if you attack it too aggressively, you might escalate this from observation to something else. Something worse." Marcus had wanted to ask what could be worse than having an unidentified entity inside your firebase, but Kowalski had already walked away. That night was humid, strange for the time of year, but the weather in Afghanistan could be unpredictable. There were low clouds moving in from the south, creating a ceiling that seemed only about 200 feet above the mountain. The wind stopped at 2:45. This time, Marcus wasn't surprised. He was almost expecting it. He didn't call it in immediately, he just waited, observing, the way Kowalski had suggested. The shapes came from multiple directions. He counted at least 5 distinct entities, moving slowly along the perimeter, not attempting to cross the wire. They moved like soldiers conducting a perimeter patrol themselves. Deliberate, methodical, professional even. One of them approached his observation post directly. It walked right up to the fence, a chain-link fence that would have been trivially easy to cut through or climb over, and stopped. It was close enough now that Marcus could almost make out details. Almost. It was vaguely humanoid, but the body was too thin. The limbs seemed to have too many joints. The head was shaped wrong, extended somehow, though Marcus couldn't see features clearly enough to understand the exact proportions. It didn't appear to have eyes, or if it did, they didn't glow or reflect light the way eyes should. The thing raised one of its elongated arms and placed what might have been a hand against the fence. Marcus didn't move. He kept his breathing steady. He let the thing look at him or sense him or whatever it was doing. The file contained incident reports going back 8 years. Multiple accounts of movement on the perimeter that couldn't be explained. Sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. Shapes in the darkness that had been reported by at least 15 different soldiers. Nothing official. Everything classified as possible wildlife or sensor errors. But the patterns were clear. The activity increased in February and March. It was always on the perimeters, never crossing the wire. It was always observed in pairs or groups. It seemed to be attracted to military installations. "What are they, sir?" Marcus asked. "We don't know," the captain said. "And officially, we don't talk about them. But soldiers have been seeing these things at forward bases for decades. Maybe longer. We don't know what they are or what they want. Do they ever attack? Not that we've ever documented. They observe. They seem curious, but they don't attempt to breach the wire or cause direct harm. Then what do we do about it? We maintain security. We document what we can. We watch them watching us, and we rotate soldiers out when their tours are complete, so they can go home and try to convince themselves they never saw anything." Marcus understood then. The military knew something was happening, but the thing was so far outside the scope of traditional military problems that there was no existing framework to address it. So they simply managed it, contained it, and kept it quiet. Marcus's tour ended on April 3rd. His final shift on the perimeter came the night before his rotation back to the States. Some guys would want to sleep through their last night on a dangerous mountain. Marcus requested the 2 to 4 a.m. watch again. He wasn't sure why, except that maybe he needed closure of some kind. It was a clear night, cool but not cold. The stars were brilliant. He took his position on the eastern perimeter, the same section where this had all started 2 months before. Around 2:45, the wind stopped. These shapes came from the valleys, moving up the slope toward the firebase. 5 of them, the same group that had been observing the base for weeks. They approached the fence and stopped. This time, they didn't try to approach Marcus directly. They simply stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if on some signal, they all turned their heads, if they were heads, toward him. It was a synchronized movement, perfectly executed. They stood like that for maybe 30 seconds, and then they withdrew. As they walked back into the darkness, one of them paused. It glanced back, a movement that Marcus could have sworn was deliberate, and in that moment he understood something with absolute clarity. They hadn't been trying to breach the firebase. They hadn't been conducting hostile reconnaissance. They were watching the Watchers. They were studying how humans guarded their own kind, and they had found whatever it was they were looking for. Marcus never saw them again after that night. The military had changed his orders, and he rotated home 2 days ahead of schedule. Other soldiers would continue to man the firebase. Other soldiers would see shapes in the darkness and struggle with what those shapes meant. But Marcus had his answer. Marcus Chen eventually left the army. He's now working as a security consultant in Colorado, far from any military base. He doesn't talk publicly about what he saw on that mountain. When people ask him about his deployment, he gives the standard answer. It was difficult, instructive, and he's glad to be home. But every February, when the wind dies and the nights grow still, he finds himself checking the locks on his doors. He finds himself staying up late, watching the darkness beyond his windows, waiting for shapes to emerge. And sometimes, lying in bed in the silence before dawn, he wonders if his eyes are the only thing that's watching back. That's the thing about encounters like Marcus's, they don't really end. They just fade into the background of a person's life, informing decisions, shaping perspectives, making you understand that the world is deeper and stranger than the neat categories we use to organize it. The military still operates Firebase Outpost 12. Soldiers still rotate through, stand watch on the perimeters, and most of them see nothing unusual. But every once in a while, someone reports movement in the valleys, shapes that don't match any known wildlife, activity that stops when challenged and resumes when the soldiers retreat. The military handles it the way they always have. They document it, they manage it, and they rotate the soldiers out when their tours are complete. Because what else can you do when you're faced with something that exists outside your understanding of what's possible? You acknowledge it, you watch for it, and you keep the watch changing so new eyes can attempt to understand what it is that's watching back. If you've ever served at a forward base or heard stories from other soldiers about unexplained activity, I'd genuinely like to know your perspective. Have you ever encountered something that didn't fit into any reasonable explanation? Or has a soldier you know ever shared an experience like this? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they deserve to be heard by others who understand what it's like to face something beyond the framework of normal experience. And if you found this account compelling, please subscribe to Military Stories, where we bring you the documented accounts of soldiers who've experienced the extraordinary. There's so much more out there than most people realize, and we're uncovering the stories that remind us of that truth.